on Valentine's Day, everything gets molded into hearts, right? There's heart-shaped candies and chocolates and cakes and cookies and all that. But I don't know that I've ever seen heart-shaped Jello, because I think it probably would communicate the wrong message to your Valentine. It may be sweet and shiny, but there's just not much substance to it, right? It jiggles around and gets away from you on your plate. That's how it is with Jello. And I think that's how our deceitful hearts are. Because we can say sweet words, we can make shiny promises, and yet our heart still jiggles around and finds ways to slide around the promises that we make, and even around God's commands. It's that deceitfulness. And so here, after recalling the limitation of swearing falsely, Jesus wants us to grasp its implication for equivocation. To equivocate is when we use ambiguous language or to avoid commitment, to conceal the truth, or to justify wrongs that we've done. And that's what Jesus describes here in Matthew 5:34 through 36. He says, "But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by the earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black." Well, what is he talking about there? As we saw a moment ago in Deuteronomy 6:13, the Lord commanded the people of Israel to swear by his name. But by Jesus' time, the Jewish rabbis had identified other oaths as less binding. And so that's what he's doing here. He's giving examples of swearing by heaven, right, rather than the name of the Lord. Swearing by earth, swearing by Jerusalem, or even swearing by your own head. And the theory was that if you did that, it would leave you a way out of whatever that commitment was. Well, of course, Jesus is rejecting that and these distinctions that they're making. Because really what they're doing, their distorted reasoning here is trying to limit God. It's like they're trying to press him into their mold. And assumes that, well, as long as I don't say his name, then it's like you're free and clear to jiggle around, be dishonest. And that's a ridiculous thing. God has no limitations. He sees through those sorts of legalistic games. And that's what Jesus is saying. Heaven, earth, Jerusalem, even our heads belong to him. And he's the one who numbers the hairs of our head. And so nothing is outside of God's control. And so those sorts of lesser oaths, those sorts of games are just equivocations that flow from a deceitful heart. Now, you may know that there are some people who take Matthew 5:34 to mean that Christians should never take a formal oath in court or in any other setting, but I doubt that was what Jesus was getting at. Because for one thing, his focus here is on the heart. It's not on drawing new boundaries that you can play with. Plus, Revelation 10:6 actually speaks of a holy angel who swears, it says, by him who lives forever and ever. Now, maybe angels are exempt from this command of Jesus. I don't know that that's the case, but even if we allow for that, think about this. If all oaths are forbidden for Christians, then what does that mean for vows, for other promises? Now, there's no mention in the New Testament of a Christian taking an oath, but there is a mention in Acts 18:18. We looked at it a few months back, where the Apostle Paul had taken a vow while he was in the city of Corinth. And you know what's interesting about this? This same word that Jesus uses in Matthew 5 to talk about taking an oath is often used in Scripture to talk about how God makes promises. And so in Luke chapter 1, verses 73 through 75, it's Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. And this is his great expression of praise after John's birth. And he speaks of the oath that God, swore to our father Abraham to grant us that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. Right? This oath that God made to Abraham is his covenant promise. It's one of the early steps in the unfolding of his saving plan. It's first mentioned in Genesis 12, verse 3, where God promises that all the families of the earth will be blessed in Abraham. And of course, Jesus came to bring that about. By fulfilling the law for us, he makes it possible for us to draw near to God, to have hope. And so, as Zechariah says there, we can serve God without fear. We can live with confidence. Why? Because God swore an oath. Because God makes promises and declares his truthfulness. Now, in fact, I would even suggest this: doubting God and his oath, as Zechariah speaks of it, is what leads to the sort of equivocation that we're talking about. On one hand, sometimes people use oaths and promises to exploit other people. And think of maybe a dishonest salesman who will say anything to get your money, who will swear to it, who will promise one thing after another. Or we see it in politicians all the time, right? They will say anything to get your vote. And what's behind that is this belief that God won't hold you accountable, that it doesn't really matter what you say. But again, there are other occasions where we hear of God himself swearing, and often they refer to the affirmation of judgment, that judgment will come. Hebrews 3, verses 11 through 12, quotes one of those verses from Psalm 95 and applies it to us. It says this: "As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." And so the author of Hebrews says, that's a quote from Psalm 95, and the author of Hebrews says, "Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God." And so we can't discount God's judgment. Right? That should lead us away from that kind of equivocation. But then on the other hand, I think some people resort to using equivocation because they're afraid. Maybe you found yourself in a situation like that, where you make an oath or promise, you swear to something to get out of a scary situation. Now, the Apostle Peter did that. Remember, he promised Jesus that he wouldn't fall away. But then after the Jewish leaders come and arrest Jesus, Peter denies knowing him. And as he does that, Matthew 26, verses 73 and 74, describe it this way. It says, "After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, 'Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you.' And it says, then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, 'I do not know the man.' And immediately the rooster crowed." Well, does it matter that, at least as it's recounted here, does it matter that he didn't swear by God's name? Does that excuse what he says here? Not at all. Because he denied the Lord, he denied Christ with a false oath. On one level, we can sympathize with Peter in that he was afraid. Jesus was off being beaten and interrogated at that moment, and would later be scourged and crucified. And yet we know Peter could have responded differently. He could have drawn confidence from the promise of God. He could have boldly confessed his faith in Jesus. Now, we might never find ourselves in a situation like that, a threatening situation like that. But that tendency to equivocate and still slip into our relationship with God, to our commitment to following Christ. I mean, think about it. Have you ever made promises to God, commitments that you aren't seeking to fulfill? I mean, we have to confess we all have done that. Do you ever say one thing, but then deny it by how you live? So we get back to this point that we have to confess that we all have deceitful hearts. And that we need Jesus to save us and to help us overcome.